Most people pray asking God to bless what they're already doing, but Psalm 23 is different. It's a declaration that you are no longer in charge. And the moment you stop leading your life, God starts directing it. See, the problem isn't that God isn't powerful enough. The problem is that you keep holding the steering wheel. Psalm 23 begins with a bold statement, "The Lord is my shepherd." That means you're not wandering, guessing, or forcing outcomes anymore. You're being led. When you pray this psalm every morning, you're resetting your mindset before the world gets a chance to program you with fear, pressure, and confusion. You're reminding yourself that provision is handled, direction is guaranteed, and peace is authorized. Do this consistently, and you'll notice something shift, not just around you, but within you, because when God takes control, chaos loses its influence. Most people think prayer is a religious habit, something you do out of routine, something you squeeze in when life gets hard. But prayer was never designed to be a ritual. It was designed to be a transfer of responsibility, a transfer of authority, a transfer of control. And the reason so many people pray but still live stressed, anxious, and overwhelmed is because they talk to God without ever turning anything over to God. They pray, but they don't release. They speak, but they don't surrender. When you pray Psalm 23 every morning, the first thing you're declaring is not a request, it's a position. The Lord is my shepherd. That one sentence settles the leadership question. A shepherd leads, sheep follow. That means you're no longer volunteering to run your own life. You're stepping out of the CEO seat and letting God take it. And here's the part most people miss. Whatever you insist on controlling, God will allow you to struggle with. But whatever you surrender, God will supervise. Prayer becomes powerful the moment it stops being informational and starts being transformational. God already knows what you need. Prayer isn't for his awareness, it's for your alignment. The moment you wake up and declare that God is your shepherd, you are consciously deciding that your emotions don't get to lead you today, your past doesn't get to define you today, and your circumstances don't get to intimidate you today. You're making a decision before the day makes demands on you. Most stress is not caused by too much responsibility. It's caused by responsibility you were never meant to carry. You were never designed to figure everything out, hold everything together, and anticipate every outcome. That's why anxiety shows up when control stays in human hands. But when you pray Psalm 23, you are placing the weight of decision-making back where it belongs. You're saying, I don't need to know how this works out, I just need to know who's leading. Here's the truth most people don't like to hear. God will not compete with you for control. He's not going to wrestle the steering wheel out of your hands. He waits until you let go. And that's why prayer isn't passive, and it's an act of courage. It takes faith to release control, especially when you've been the one managing survival for a long time. But faith isn't believing God can. Faith is trusting God too. Every time you pray Psalm 23, you're making a legal declaration in the spiritual realm. You're saying provision is no longer my job, protection is no longer my job, direction is no longer my job. And the moment you make that declaration consistently, peace begins to show up without explanation. Not because everything changed around you, but because something changed within you. Control shifted. And watch this, when leadership changes, behavior changes. You stop reacting emotionally. You stop forcing outcomes. You stop rushing decisions. Why? Because sheep don't stress about the path. They trust the shepherd. The confidence isn't in where you're going. It's in who's guiding you. That's why Psalm 23 doesn't begin with abundance. It begins with authority. Everything else flows from that. Some of you are tired, not because you're doing too much, but because you're leading too much. You're trying to be God in your own life, and that's exhausting. When you pray this psalm in the morning, you're giving yourself permission to rest before the work even begins. You're saying, I'm going to move today, but I'm not going to strive. I'm going to act, but I'm not going to panic. This is why consistency matters. One prayer may calm your emotions, but daily surrender retrains your identity. Over time, you stop seeing yourself as the one who has to make everything happen, and you start seeing yourself as the one who follows wisdom. And when you follow wisdom, outcomes start aligning without force. So if you want God to take control of your life, stop asking Him to bless your plans and start submitting to His leadership. Say it every morning until your spirit believes it. The Lord is my shepherd. I am not in charge anymore. And that's when everything begins to shift. What you repeat every day eventually becomes what you believe, and what you believe quietly dictates how you live. That's why morning matters. Before the world gets a chance to speak fear into you, pressure into you, and distraction into you, something has to speak truth over you. Psalm 23 is not just a comforting passage, it's a script. And whatever script you rehearse consistently becomes the program running your life. Most people don't realize they are already rehearsing something every morning. Some rehearse worry, some rehearse lack, some rehearse past failures. They wake up and immediately start replaying conversations, mistakes, bills, and deadlines. That rehearsal empowers fear without them even noticing. But when you intentionally rehearse Psalm 23, you are replacing unconscious programming with deliberate alignment. When you say, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," you are not denying reality, you are defining it. Want is not about resources, it's about mindset. Two people can have the same bank account and live completely different emotional lives. One feels secure, the other feels anxious. Why? Because what you rehearse determines what you expect, and expectation shapes experience. Daily rehearsal builds spiritual muscle. You don't become confident by accident. Confidence is trained, peace is trained, trust is trained. When you declare, "He leads me beside still waters," you are reminding your nervous system that chaos is not your default. Pressure is not your home. You are being led, not chased. And over time, your body starts believing what your mouth keeps declaring. This is why consistency beats intensity. One emotional prayer might move you for a moment, but a daily declaration reshapes your perception. Psalm 23 begins to act like a lens. You start interpreting life differently. Delays don't feel like denial. Silence doesn't feel like abandonment. Challenges don't feel like punishment. Why? Because your rehearsal has trained you to expect guidance even when you don't see it yet. Most people think faith is about hype. It's not. Faith is about habit. Faith is built in quiet repetition. It's built when no one is watching. It's built when you say the same truth again on a day when nothing seems to be changing. That's where real authority forms. Because authority doesn't come from emotion, it comes from conviction. Watch what happens when Psalm 23 becomes your daily language. You stop speaking desperation. You stop speaking fear-based predictions. You stop saying, "I don't know what I'm going to do." Instead, your words start aligning with leadership. You say things like, "I'll be led, and provision is handled, and this will make sense in time." And words aren't neutral. Words shape decisions. Decisions shape outcomes. Rehearsal also sharpens discernment. When your spirit is saturated with truth, confusion loses its grip. You become slower to panic and quicker to pause. You don't chase every opportunity because you trust guidance. You don't react to every problem because you expect direction. That kind of restraint looks like wisdom, but it's really the result of repetition. Some of you are asking God for clarity while rehearsing uncertainty every morning. You're asking for peace while feeding anxiety daily. But you cannot starve fear occasionally and expect it to disappear. You replace it. Psalm 23 does that. It replaces internal noise with divine order. It shifts your inner dialogue before external circumstances try to define it. And here's the powerful part. What you rehearse privately eventually shows up publicly. People will notice something different about you. Not because life got easier, but because you got steadier. Pressure doesn't move you the same way. Delays don't shake you the same way. Why? Because your spirit has been trained to rest while being led. So don't underestimate the power of what you repeat. Every morning, you are either reinforcing fear or reinforcing faith. Psalm 23 is a daily choice to empower trust over tension, leadership over guessing, peace over panic. Rehearse it until it becomes your reflex, and you'll discover that what once controlled you no longer has authority over you. One of the hardest things for a driven person to do is follow. We've been trained to lead, decide, push, and figure it out. From a young age, we're taught that independence is strength and self-reliance is maturity. But Psalm 23 opens with a statement that challenges everything we've been conditioned to believe. The Lord is my shepherd. That single sentence implies something radical. You are not the leader, and that's not weakness, that's wisdom. Leading without clarity creates exhaustion. You can be busy and still be lost. You can be productive and still be moving in the wrong direction. That's why so many people are tired even when they're accomplishing things. They're leading themselves without guidance. When you let God lead, you're not giving up responsibility, you're giving up confusion. You're trading pressure for purpose. A shepherd doesn't rush sheep. He guides them, and sheep don't need to see the whole path. They just need to stay close. That's where peace comes from, proximity, not prediction. Most anxiety comes from trying to see 10 steps ahead when you've only been assigned the next one. But when God is leading, clarity comes in increments. You don't get the full blueprint, you get the next instruction, and that's enough. Letting go of leadership first is an act of trust. It's saying, I don't need to understand everything before I move. Some of you are stuck, not because you lack opportunity, but because you refuse to move without guarantees. But faith doesn't move with guarantees. Faith moves with guidance. And guidance only shows up when you're willing to follow. This is why Psalm 23 doesn't say God gives directions from a distance. It says He leads. That implies movement together. And when you're being led, timing matters. You stop forcing things early. You stop clinging to things that are over. You start recognizing when it's time to move and when it's time to wait. That discernment doesn't come from strategy, it comes from submission. A lot of people want God's results without God's process. They want the destination without the dependence. But dependence is not a deficiency, it's a design. Sheep were created to follow, and humans were created to be led by wisdom greater than themselves. When you fight that design, life gets heavy. When you align with it, life gets ordered. Watch how letting God lead changes your decisions. You stop making choices out of fear. You stop choosing what feels urgent over what's actually important. You become less reactive and more responsive. And that shift alone saves you years of unnecessary detours. Because the fastest route is not always the right route. Some of the greatest mistakes in life happen when you move without being led. You jump into relationships without direction. You chase money without alignment. You say yes to opportunities without peace. And then you wonder why things feel off. It's not because God wasn't present. It's because you didn't pause long enough to follow. When God leads, rest shows up in the middle of responsibility. That's why Psalm 23 talks about green pastures and still waters. Those aren't vacation spots, they're signs of trust. They show up when you're moving at the right pace. If everything feels rushed, pressured, and frantic, leadership might be misaligned. Following God doesn't mean life becomes effortless. It means effort becomes focused. You stop wasting energy on things that were never assigned to you. You stop trying to control outcomes that were never your responsibility. And when that happens, strength returns, clarity sharpens, confidence stabilizes. So if you want direction, don't ask for a map, ask for leadership, and be willing to release control long enough to receive it, because the moment you stop insisting on being in front is the moment guidance starts showing up in front of you. Peace is not the absence of problems, it's the evidence of proper leadership. When God is truly in control, anxiety loses its authority. Not because challenges disappear, but because fear no longer has permission to dominate your inner world. That's why Psalm 23 doesn't promise a trouble-free life. It promises a guided one, and guidance produces peace, even in the presence of pressure. Most people think peace comes after everything works out, but peace actually shows up before outcomes change. It's a signal, not a reward. Still waters aren't about external calm, they're about internal alignment. When your spirit is aligned with divine leadership, your emotions begin to settle. You stop living on edge. You stop bracing for impact. You stop expecting the worst by default. Anxiety is often the result of misplaced responsibility. When you believe it's all on you, your nervous system stays activated. You're always anticipating, always preparing, always protecting. But when you acknowledge that God is in control, something shifts inside you. Your shoulders relax, your breathing slows, your thoughts become clearer. That's not psychological trickery. That's spiritual order restoring balance. Peace becomes proof that leadership has changed. You can't say God is leading while fear is driving. One cancels the other out. If anxiety is constantly steering your decisions, then control hasn't fully transferred yet. But the moment you pray Psalm 23 with intention, you're not just asking for calm, you're authorizing it. You're declaring that chaos no longer gets the final say. This is why peace doesn't require explanations. It doesn't need everything to make sense. It simply needs trust. When you trust the leader, you don't panic about the route. You may not understand the terrain, but you trust the guide. And that trust settles the soul. Peace isn't ignorance, it's confidence without details. Some of you have been measuring God's presence by external results instead of internal peace. You're asking, why isn't this fixed yet? Instead of noticing, why am I no longer shaken? That inner shift is not accidental. It's the fruit of surrender. It's evidence that something deeper is happening beneath the surface. Still waters also represent pace. When God is leading, life doesn't feel rushed, even when it's full. You're busy, but not frantic. Active, but not anxious. Movement without panic is a sign of alignment. If everything feels urgent, leadership might be off. God doesn't drive people with pressure. He leads them with peace. And here's the powerful part. Peace becomes protection. When your heart is settled, you make better decisions. You don't say yes out of fear. You don't stay out of insecurity. You don't chase what's loud or impressive. You choose from clarity, not desperation. That alone prevents countless mistakes. Peace also attracts clarity. When your emotions are calm, your discernment sharpens. You hear more clearly. You notice subtle guidance. You sense when something is off without needing dramatic signs. Anxiety drowns out wisdom. Peace amplifies it. Some of you have been praying for God to change your circumstances, but what He's been changing is your internal state. Because once peace is established within you, circumstances lose their power to control you. Pressure can exist without producing panic. Opposition can show up without stealing confidence. Delays can happen without destroying hope. This is why Psalm 23 works. It doesn't deny reality. It redefines authority. It reminds you that no matter what's happening around you, there is a greater order operating within you. And when that order is restored, fear no longer gets to run the show. So if peace is missing, don't chase calm, check control. Ask yourself who's really leading, because when God is in charge, still waters follow. Most people underestimate what consistency does because they're obsessed with moments. They want breakthroughs, encounters, and sudden shifts, but God often works through rhythm, not rush. One prayer can touch your emotions, but a repeated prayer rewires your direction. That's why Psalm 23 prayed once can encourage you, but Psalm 23 prayed daily begins to govern you. Momentum doesn't come from intensity. It comes from alignment practiced over time. When you return to the same truth every morning, you're not being repetitive. You're being intentional. You're telling your spirit what matters before life tells you what's urgent. And over time, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. You don't have to force faith anymore. Trust becomes your default. Peace becomes familiar. Guidance becomes expected. Consistency invites God into the ordinary, and that's where real transformation lives. Anybody can pray when they're desperate. Anybody can cry out in crisis. But daily prayer says, I trust you even when nothing feels wrong. That kind of faith creates spiritual traction. It's like compound interest. Small deposits made consistently produce results you couldn't manufacture on your own. Momentum is created when obedience becomes a habit. When Psalm 23 becomes part of your morning routine, you stop negotiating with fear. You stop debating whether God will show up. You expect leadership. You expect provision. You expect direction. And expectation changes behavior. You walk differently. You decide differently. You respond differently. Not because life got easier, but because trust got deeper. This is how God begins to orchestrate things behind the scenes. Opportunities align without strain. Conversations happen at the right time. Doors open without manipulation. And most of the time, you won't even realize it's happening until you look back and see how smoothly things came together. That's momentum. When effort decreases, but effectiveness increases. Consistency also builds resilience. When prayer is daily, setbacks don't derail you the way they used to. You don't spiral emotionally. You don't abandon your faith because something didn't work out. Why? Because your confidence isn't rooted in outcomes. It's rooted in leadership. You trust the process because you trust the guide. Some of you have been praying occasionally and wondering why life still feels unstable. It's not because God isn't faithful. It's because consistency hasn't had time to do its work. Stability is built, not begged for, and daily surrender is how it's built. There's also something powerful about returning to the same declaration day after day. It humbles you. It reminds you that growth is a journey, not a performance. You don't graduate from dependence. You deepen in it. And as dependence deepens, effort lightens. You're still disciplined, but you're no longer driven by pressure. Momentum doesn't mean everything goes your way. It means everything moves you forward. Even mistakes become lessons. Even delays become preparation. Even opposition becomes confirmation. When God is leading consistently, nothing is wasted. Everything is integrated. And here's the quiet miracle of consistency. You become unrecognizable to your old self. The things that used to trigger you no longer control you. The fears that once dominated you lose their grip. The urgency that used to exhaust you fades, not overnight, but undeniably, day by day, prayer by prayer. So don't chase dramatic change, commit to daily alignment. Pray Psalm 23 every morning, not because you feel like it, but because leadership matters. And over time, you'll realize God didn't just shift your circumstances, He shifted you.